So next up is Joan Ogden. She's also a theoretical physicist. She was a colleague of Bob's and mine here at Princeton for 18 years. She's now at the University of California, Davis for the last 10 to 15 years. With Bob, she co-authored a monograph that was called Solar Hydrogen, Moving Beyond Fossil Fuels in 1989. She and Bob and I also worked on a project together crawling around sugar mills in Jamaica to understand energy use in sugar production, and in particular, how to make more electricity available from the renewable biomass that comes out of that. So we've had some interesting experiences together. So I'll turn it over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Eric. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I promise not to make you guys get up and do jumping jacks after lunch. But I'm going to talk a little about charting a transition to sustainable transportation. And this comes out of work that I've done starting here at Princeton, but also at the University of California, Davis, where I head up a program of that name. And we have a number of researchers and students looking in particular at transportation, fuel, and vehicle pathways. So this has been covered before, some of the challenges that are facing the transport sector in particular: growth of demand, especially in developing countries, security of energy supply, greenhouse gas emissions, also air pollution, and water, land, and material constraints. And these are serious issues facing new transport technologies and transportation fuels. There are usually three sets of options that people mention when they talk about dealing with these issues, sort of three sets of solutions to climate change, air quality, energy security. One is sort of generally lumped as transportation efficiency. This can be fuel economy, but also things like reducing congestion on roads, intelligent transportation, and automation of vehicles, that sort of thing. Alternative fuel and vehicle technologies: hydrogen, biofuels, electric battery vehicles, advanced IC engines, low carbon liquid fuels, all of these. And finally, reducing vehicle kilometers traveled. And there are a number of ways to approach this, including things like ride sharing or carpooling, mass transit, urban design. So when people put together the transportation part of future scenarios, future low carbon scenarios, they often invoke one or more often all of these as possible solutions for what our future transport sector is going to look like. This is one such example. This is from the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Perspectives report. This was one from 2012, but this is very typical. This is a 4-degree case, so this is limited to a 4-degree C temperature rise globally. And this is a picture of the future transportation light-duty fleet, passenger vehicles. These are gasoline and diesel vehicles and gasoline hybrids. And up here you see little bars for plug-in hybrids and battery and fuel cell cars. So they don't play that large a role in the 4-degree world, but in the 2-degree world, which is represented here, you see by 2050, a large majority are either plug-in vehicles, which are shown here, battery vehicles or plug-in hybrids, or else fuel cells shown at the top. So pretty much all of the studies that have looked at what an optimized system to meet low carbon goals, say by 2050 or beyond, see a major role for these alternative fuels and vehicles. And looking at this really represents a revolution in what would have to happen in terms of changing the transport sector, not only new types of fuels, but potentially new types of vehicles as well. Also of added interest now, heightened interest, is options for zero-emission freight technologies. There's been a lot of work that's gone on looking at zero emission for light-duty vehicles, cars, light trucks, that kind of thing. But more recently, we're saying, well, how can we address this for freight sectors? This shows U.S. transportation energy by mode. These are the light vehicles here, but we have trucks and air. All of these add up, and globally, close to half of the energy use is due to these freight modes. So there's a lot of interest and experimentation going on now. With freight, electric freight is an obvious one, but people are also looking at other fuels for trains, including things like LNG and hydrogen. For ships, buses, there are electrified and fuel cell buses that exist, and trucks. So a lot of interest in decarbonizing this. transport is sometimes thought of as the harder sector to decarbonize. A lot of scenarios show a lot of energy efficiency across the board, but maybe decarbonizing first in electricity. But transportation will certainly be necessary if we're going to meet anything like a 2-degree world or below. And so anyway, and freight will be necessary in addition to light duty. So another thing that's been happening is kind of the confluence of the transport sector and the electricity sector. And of course, as the electricity sector is decarbonizing, people think of ways of trying to capture renewable intermittent electricity. And I'll let Bob talk about this. He has some very interesting creative ideas about that. But people talk about things like making hydrogen, which then can either be made into other fuels and go into our existing systems, or possibly go back into the power grid in some way. There's a lot of confluence now with electric charging. So what happens in the transportation sector in terms of when the demand happens, how large it is, what kind of demand can affect what happens in the electric sector as well. And that's something new. So what are the roles that different types of vehicles might play in a future transport sector? This is a graph, and pretty much all of the automakers have graphs like this too. What's shown here is, down here it's kind of the length of the average trip. So down here, 10 miles average daily mileage. That might be a small urban car, it might travel that amount each day. But you get out to larger cars, and certainly things like long-haul trucks, they'll be going many hundreds or even more per day. And then on this axis is the weight of the vehicle in tons. And again, the cars are lighter weight, and then you have heavier duty vehicles going all the way up to very heavy duty vehicles, very heavy vehicles like ships. And so this graph now shows oops, let's see, what did I do? I did this too. See if I can get it back. No, okay. Don't touch anything. Okay. I did it myself. Very cool. Not bad for a theoretical physicist, huh? So anyway, we have here a depiction, and this was put together by Shell. It was, and also Toyota and Hyundai, a group of industry folks. The light blue down here is battery cars. So these are pure battery vehicles. And then in this range, the green range is fuel cells and then liquid fuels. And so the judgment of this industry group was that for different types of applications, this is small cars. See if I can get back out of it again. No? Okay. Got to stop doing that. So there's the small cars and then larger cars, and the size of the circle represents the size of the energy demand. And so these medium to large cars are a big deal, the small cars, and then things like long-haul trucks and so on. And so what this picture says, I guess the thing to take away from this is we're not looking at a monoculture anymore. We're looking at least the best guess of these industry partners who are car makers as well as oil company. They see multiple fuels possibly coming into play. Electric battery vehicles, maybe for smaller vehicles, for larger vehicles, both on the cars and the trucks and buses, things like fuel cells, and then maybe liquid fuels being needed for aviation and shipping. And so instead of something that's petroleum-derived liquid fuels, which is pretty much what all of the fuels we use in transport are today, we're looking at multiple different pathways and different kinds of primary sources as well. And certainly the pathways that use electricity can tap into lots of different primary sources, including low-carbon pathways, as we saw before. Same thing holds true for hydrogen and also liquid fuels. So this is very different. And if we're going to transform this large system that we have, which is run basically on petroleum-based fuels, we really are looking at a revolution. One of the things we've been looking at a lot in my group in Davis is energy transitions. And so as part of this, in 2015, I was lucky enough to get a writing fellowship to the Bellagio Institute in Italy, and I read a lot of papers went back and read a lot of classic papers on transitions, and there were some things that seemed pretty relevant for transportation. And these are some robust attributes from a couple of articles and authors. Reductions in cost, improvements through extended period of learning, so learning by doing. Scale up at the unit level, realizing scale effects, followed by a scale up at the industry level. And what this really means is in the lab going from making small pieces of jewelry to whole panels, let's say, and then scaling up an industry where you're manufacturing thousands of solar panels a day, that sort of thing. Competition among technologies. 4 is an important one, coevolution of long-lived infrastructures and technology clusters due to network effects. So it makes it hard for any component to be different. And I think what this sort of means, one thing this means is that if you have an existing infrastructure, it's easier to build on top of that than it is to build a brand new infrastructure of some kind, although it's not impossible to do that. The 5th one, too, this is based on historical observations that transitions often start at relatively small local or regional scales and then evolve to larger spatial scales and then become truly global. And certainly this could be true in transportation in places where, for example, you needed new type of vehicles and new types of infrastructure. You wouldn't try to do that everywhere in the world to begin with. You would concentrate geographically and begin. And I think the same thing might be said for CCS perhaps as well. Historically, their energy transitions have been pretty slow. It's certainly a multi-decadal kind of thing for the energy system to change. But there's certain things that can make it go faster. If you have a smaller the scale, it's more difficult to transform a very large market. Infrastructure needs, the more complex, the slower the change. Uncertainties about policy and technology can lead to risk-averse behavior, which can really stall transitions. And we certainly have observed this. And I think several speakers earlier noted the importance of having a consistent long-term policy framework to give industry confidence about making investments that they need to make. And if this is not the case, it will stall investment and increase the risk and lead people to not act, even if it looks like it could be promising. And then I think finally the last one, comparative advantage across multiple dimensions, is important as well. One of the compelling things about zero-emission vehicles is not just that you can tap into electricity or hydrogen and make that from lots of low-carbon pathways. It's also important that you have zero tailpipe emissions and you can help ameliorate air pollution damages, for example. And there was a study that Bob and I did with Eric as well a number of years ago, and the air pollution damage costs could be quite sizable in terms of determining this. As well as other sustainability advantages. For example, things like water use and land use can come into play. So that can help if you have something that can solve multiple problems. And so we look at all these things in looking at transportation solutions. Just a little bit about timelines for transitions. This is a vehicle commercialization timeline that we put together, looking at the stages, and we developed this talking to a number of automakers who help support our program at Davis. There could be a long period of research and development. The R&D can stretch back for a couple of decades, but you go through stages of prototype development, testing one-of-a-kind cars out, then pre-commercial sales. And if we look at the fuel cell example, this is pretty much where we are now. We're in pre-commercial sales. There were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of these sold last year, about 1,000 of which are in California. And the hope is we'll go on to commercial sales. Even if that takes off, though, it takes a longer time for the fleet fraction to build up. So if you think of this as new vehicle type X, whatever that may be, you can see that it's a multi-decade time frame to get to, say, 50% of the vehicles on the road. And you really have to start several decades beforehand. And this kind of scenario, when we talked to the automakers, this was about as fast as you could reasonably go without a real crash project. So long time frame. Historical data here from an old paper about the timing to build transportation infrastructure, starting with canals, railroads. Again, sort of the time constant of the half time here was 30 to 70 years. So we're not talking about something we can do overnight, but we are talking about something that if we want to meet those climate goals, that we're talking about 2050. 2050 is kind of tomorrow in terms of needing to get started and building the first parts of this in transportation. So I'm going to now focus on zero-emission vehicles and talk about some aspects of transitions there. It's really 3 coupled transitions: new kinds of vehicles, battery vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, new fuel infrastructure. In the sense for electricity, we do have that distributed to our houses, but we also need to build things like fast chargers and probably charging at work. And then shift to zero net carbon pathways. And it may be, as with electric vehicles, now we're starting with electricity that could come from fossil sources. They're not zero carbon sources yet, but there's a path to decarbonizing over time. We've been thinking about light duty vehicles with zero emission, but there's a growing interest in medium heavy duty vehicles too, especially fleets coming along there. So one of the most important things is the early market dynamics in getting any kind of vehicle thing going. And I certainly have learned a good bit about this since moving to California and serving on a number of committees for the state that were looking at, let's say, implementing electric battery vehicles or hydrogen vehicles and roadmaps for those. You need to have, in this case, automakers, station developers, and government acting at the same place at the same time. In the example of fuel cells, you need to have the stations there a little bit before the vehicles get there, but not too far in advance. And you need to have policies that are going to support early adopters who want to buy the vehicles as well as fuel providers. And actions over, let's say the next, over the first 10 to 15 years are really critical for launching alternative fuel pathways. And generally there has to be some nurturing and support, because at small scale in the first vehicles, you're not generally going to have a strict economic business case right in year one. You're going to need to take a longer viewpoint, and sometimes during the risk, that longer viewpoint means the need for some government support. So this is another representation of that. This represents infrastructure investment for a new type of vehicle, or a new type of fuel for a vehicle. And typically, you initially want to build enough stations that people will have coverage. They'll be able to use those stations. But there may not be enough cars there to fully utilize that. So the economics are not so good. So it takes a while of building out the infrastructure before you have enough cars to fully utilize it, and the whole system scales up enough that you then start to make money. You cross over into positive territory. So in our experience looking at this initial barrier, infrastructure cost barrier, can last for perhaps 10 years. And it's really important, again, to have a long view and have a commitment. So putting alt fuel infrastructure out there takes a fair amount of commitment. I'm going to now give a couple of results from some transition scenarios we did for the US looking at a zero-emission vehicle light-duty fleet. And this scenario goes out to 2035, and what we were interested in was that valley of death that I just showed you. How deep is that? How much would we have to invest, and what would be involved in that? So, so this scenario shows, and this is light-duty vehicle populations in the US, it shows battery cars coming in 2010, which is when they were introduced. There aren't very many of them yet, and then they start to build up. And then fuel cells and plug-in hybrids and batteries coming in 2010, fuel cells coming in about 2015. And so by the time we get out to 2035, the total here is roughly 30% of the on-road fleet. And that's roughly about 12% each here and 8% there, something like that. So we then did an analysis where we designed the infrastructure to serve all those cars, costed out what it would cost, and figured out when the infrastructure would break even in terms of being out of that valley of death and being able to supply energy. Now, for electricity, it breaks even quite soon. For hydrogen, it takes a few years. And what we found looking at these different things, we found incremental vehicle costs here. So this is a negative, this is a cost. And then we found benefits in terms of fuel savings because all of these vehicles are so much more efficient than gasoline vehicles. With electric battery vehicles, it can be a factor of 3 to 4, that the cent per mile cost is actually less, even pretty early on. And so what we find is that initially we're paying more in this scenario. We're now adding up what the incremental costs of vehicles are and what the cost of extra cost of fuel would have been. And we find initially we're paying more. These negative numbers are the sum of the plus and minuses here. But by the time we get out to about 2028, this scenario, which has some of each kind of car, takes a somewhat agnostic view and says, well, at least according to the car makers, we think there are roles for all of these. We find that we break even, and that's when you go from negative to positive here. And this bar now, which is the fuel savings, outweighs the extra cost of vehicles. if you took this out further, eventually this bar would even shrink down to pretty close to zero. But this point is interesting because this is sort of how far, at least in theory, you'd have to keep subsidizing this whole enterprise of going to an alternative fuel world. We also estimated what these incremental investments would be. Let's say we required or had government support where we were paying the difference in vehicle cost, and we were also paying to build infrastructure. If we just looked at the investments, these are for battery and plug-in hybrids and then fuel cells coming in, and then the infrastructures for those, so chargers and then fuel cell infrastructure coming in. And so if we track this over time, the average is about $23 billion a year. This is US-wide. If we now say, okay, this is the total investment, but after a certain point, we're making money, right? So let's just track until the point we make money. And that would be a subsidy. So this is the total amount of capital outlay for this stuff. But now let's look at what the subsidies would be. And it's quite a bit less. And I'll just toggle back and forth. These are the cars. If we look at, let's say, battery cars here, which are the green and red, we see that those go to a certain point and then they break even. So we don't subsidize them anymore. The fuel cells break even latest. And same thing for the infrastructure actually breaks even pretty soon for all of them. So what we find here is, okay, so the average here is about 11 billion a year, and we do this for about the next 20 years. So is that a lot of money? And so we tried to compare that number to other money flows in the transportation system. This is how much the US is spending on light-duty vehicles and their fuels, which is the numbers we were tracking. And if we compare this, it's about $1 trillion a year. So the investment we were looking at looks something like this on that scale, and the subsidy looks something like that. So we're talking about something like 1% to 2% cumulative amount if we were paying to launch this new industry, launch it to the point where it was making money and we were well on the way for these to take off. So I think it's an interesting comparison point that to get through that valley of death, although it's a lot of money, it's more than a typical R&D project, it still is not that large compared to the money flows in the overall system. And this is very much in line with other results that have been found by IEA and others who have looked at some of these transitional costs and found that actually often the savings from implementing things like in transportation zero-emission technologies also get you an efficiency benefit. And those things together can help pay for launching these technologies and making them competitive. So, anyway, just a couple of things to summarize here. Future transportation sector, not likely to be a monoculture in the sense that it's going to be all petroleum and ICE if we're going to a world where we want to reduce carbon. And launching light-duty vehicle, zero-emission technologies, the cost would be quite a bit less than the money flows in that system, the cost to buy the vehicles and the fuel to launch this technology on the order of percent. And I would also say the imperative of climate change may mean that we need to support several multiple high-value demos. And this kind of goes along with that graphic I showed from the auto companies that see different technologies playing a role for different markets. Stakeholder coordination is really important, and we're going to need to have institutional changes, and also end-use innovation is an interesting thing to think about as a driver of energy transitions. What do people want? This can really help determine what kind of cars they're going to buy, and this is something the automakers all think about quite a lot. There's an unprecedented, I think we're seeing what may be an unprecedented rate of change in transportation if it really does evolve to meet these challenges. Some analysts say, you know, Manhattan Project type thing is not a good idea. This is a quote from Arnold Gruber. But we have this imperative for climate change that really means we need to start now, given the time constants, the long time constants in the system. So how do we find a path that balances these two things? Anyway, maybe I'll just say some of the things for policies. I think one of the most important things is setting out a consistent path and not wavering too much from that, which then, you know, induces risk perception and makes it harder to do a transition. And I think having a balanced approach, portfolio approach is probably important, at least at this scale, incorporating externalities. And finally, experimenting at the network scale, I think, is really important for transportation. And by network, I mean something where you look at both the fueling system and the vehicles and how they interact with each other. So building something at enough scale that you can see how it works when you have, for example, you know, thousands of vehicles and maybe dozens of stations, and see how people actually use this. Does it work? What doesn't work? What do we need to fine-tune about how we design things? Which is very different than testing cars, you know, a fleet of 5 cars in the lab. So we're really at this network scale. The costs are more than we're used to doing, but I think we do need to experiment at that scale to really figure out how some of these things work. So some wild cards, and this gets to a conversation I was having with Rob Socolow over lunch. One of the things is autonomous vehicles and shared mobility. And if millennials all want those things instead of owning a car, it could change what kinds of cars that people buy and rent. So what do future people going to want? One thing I sometimes think about is we may be living in the golden age of travel. How much is virtual reality going to replace this? And how many of you have done long distance projects with people you've never met in person? Yeah, it's probably only going up. So one other thing I wanted to do is to introduce Bob to some of his academic grandchildren who he may not know. And like many others here, I want to thank Bob for his mentorship. I've learned the energy trade, you know, from Bob. And these are some of the 105 graduate students and postdocs who've worked with me since I've been out in Davis the last 15 years. And I like to think maybe I've been able to bring some of Bob's you know, wisdom and sagacity to helping educate these young people. So thank you very much.
One question. You didn't really address CNG as what I might call a bridge transition. Is that because you see it in the footprint of CNG fleets to be similar in terms of their carbon footprint to traditional fuels?
That's a great question. So is CNG, so the question really is, I understand, is CNG a bridge fuel toward low carbon, zero emission pathways? And I think it's kind of a distraction. It may be, if you have renewable natural gas of some kind, you know, renewable methane of some kind, then I think, yes, there would be a role in trucks and in fleets and those kinds of things in the near term. Although it may be seen as part of the solution initially, it will soon become part of the problem. And so I think it probably bears looking at what would be uses of natural gas that could be most effective in reducing CO2. Okay, thanks.